Hello, everyone, and welcome to Data Without Borders, Advanced Web Data Connector Topics. My name is Sam Desmond. I'm a senior software engineer at Tableau. In my time at Tableau, I've mostly been focused on Tableau's data connectivity space, whether that be generating SQL for your viz, or getting you signed into Google Analytics, and kind of everything in between. Lately, I've been focused on the Web Data Connector and connecting Tableau to various cloud data sources. The Web Data Connector started 2 years ago as an internal hackathon project, and that's actually when I started working on it. And it's kind of amazing to see where it's come till now. It's actually a platform that we are building a lot of the new connectors you'll see in Tableau on top of this platform. So it's something Tableau is very committed to, and we're actually adding more and more functionality to support the building of these connectors. So what we're going to share with you guys today is basically what we've learned building this platform. By the time we're done today, we're going to give you the skills to take a basic web data connector and make it a vital tool for your customers, whether that customer is yourself, your company, or the Tableau community at large. With me today, I have Brendan Lee, who's a product manager on the Web Data Connector. I'm going to turn it over to Brendan to introduce himself and kind of go over the topics we're going to cover today.
Awesome, thanks, Sam. So excited you all are here. I'm Brendan Lee. I'm a product manager for Web Data Connector and extensibility at Tableau. I love working with developers. Seeing what you all create with our platforms is just so inspiring and awesome to witness. Quick orientation slide. This is the entire Tableau developer platform. There's a lot of great stuff in here. Each one of these extensibility points does a different thing within the Tableau ecosystem. And we got a lot of great sessions on all of these. We're going to be talking today exclusively about the Web Data Connector. This is an advanced, Jedi level course, but the quick 30-minute summary slide, just in case you wandered in. Here's Tableau. It sits here. Connects natively to a lot of different data sources. So, we can connect to Hadoop, we can connect to Excel, a bunch of different other servers. But, those 50 or so native connections that we already have, it does not represent the entire data source space that is available in the world. So what happens when you have data in some sort of cloud app that's sitting out there, or an internal REST API service that you want to hit that your IT organization has set up? That's where the Web Data Connector platform really fits into the Tableau ecosystem. It kind of serves as a bridge between Tableau and the data sources that we don't support natively. So that's the basics. I think a lot of you have already written Web Data Connectors, or you're at least familiar with the concept. So what we're going to talk today about is what happens when you go beyond the basics and you run into some more scaling problems with your Web Data Connectors. What happens when you're trying to deal with a super complicated schema? You want to give your users a really nice and rich data model. What happens when you're building your Web Data Connector and you encounter a bug and you can't figure out what's going wrong with your program? We're going to talk a lot about debugging today. It's going to be super helpful. What happens when you have a Web Data Connector and you're trying to connect to a data source that uses some form of authentication, be it OAuth or basic authentication? We'll talk about that. We'll give you some sample code. And finally, what happens when you build a Web Data Connector and you want to share that work with the rest of your company via Tableau Server or Tableau Online? So that's kind of the high-level agenda. We got 4 main topics to cover today. One thing I want to say is if you have questions, raise your hand. We want to make this interactive. We do reserve the right to sidebar the question and talk about it after the session, but if you have any questions, please let us know. Before we begin, I want to give one plug for a command line utility that we built called TC16. If you install this via npm or pip, you can get a lot of great content there. It actually has a link to a Dropbox folder that contains all of the developer track sessions and sample code, so super useful. All right, so let's dive in. This session today is going to be really demo heavy because we like demos and we don't like slides all that much. So what we've built today, one of the demos we built today is a Spotify connector. By we built a Spotify connector, what I mean is I hacked up a prototype and then I gave it to Sam and he made it like really high-level engineering quality. So that's going to be kind of the example we're going through today to motivate a lot of these things. So without further ado, I'm going to show you the Spotify connector in action first before we dive into any code. All right, so here I am in Tableau 10.1. I'm going to go to the Web Data Connector, and I'm going to connect to my Spotify connector that's running locally. The first thing you see here is we're going to do OAuth authentication, which is something we're going to talk a lot more about later. I'm going to hopefully type in my password correct the first time. There we go. This connector allows us to set one filter, get some data back from Spotify. And the first thing you're going to notice here is this connector is actually using a new feature that was released in Tableau 10 called multi-table. So in the original iteration of WDC, we only allowed you to bring back a single table. We fixed that in the next version. And so you'll see here on the left, we have a bunch of different tables. So I can come in here, look at my top artists, get some information about who I've been listening to. Don't judge me for my music taste. It's there live in front of you with live data. That might not be exactly what I'm interested in, so I could come in here and say, I want to look at all my artists and all my track data. So I have this artist table. I have this tracks table. I'm not exactly sure at this point what's in that tracks table, but I'm just going to go with it here. I'm going to create my join. There's a lot of different options here. I have my ID field that I'm going to create this join on. Luckily, there's a nicely named artist ID field for the foreign key. Okay, cool. Got my data. I'm going to go start to explore it a little bit. So all this demo here is going to motivate some of the features we're going to talk about here in a sec. Do take note of that progress dialog right there. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So it's giving me some information in real time about how much data we pulled back from this connector. All right. And once that's finished, we're going to have some data to explore. All right, so here we are in Tableau. We've brought back all the information. Let's just kind of explore this data a little bit. I have tracks here. I'm going to come down, pull out all the names of my tracks. I can, look at some other things here. Maybe I want to see how my, tracks compare for whether they're explicit or not. But this field is not named very well, so I'm going to rename it to make it explicit what that field is. It's a Boolean. Is explicit. I'm a developer. That makes a lot more sense. Cool. That's interesting. Let's come and look at some of these measures that are down here. Danceability definitely sounds like the most interesting one, so I'm going to pull that out. I can see what tracks are the most danceable, which is always useful. So I can come in here, check out this field. I'm going to use this describe option to say, kind of just look at what this data is. I can see that the only values in that are values between 0 and 0.9. So I'm going to say, this is basically a percentage. What Spotify is telling me is this track is 99% danceable, something like that. So I'm going to come in here and actually change the default properties. I'm going to come into number format. Make this a percentage. Cool. Percentage information there. There's a few other things I could do real quick. Let's say I want to actually look at my artists. And I want to look danceability by artist. You'll see here, the aggregation is off, right? You have an artist that's over 100% danceability. That's because we're aggregating incorrectly. We want to aggregate by average. So that's another thing we come and fix up here in Tableau. This is kind of painful. If your users are connecting to your web data connector and this is the experience they have to go through, that's not great. Luckily, we've introduced some new features that makes them not have to go through this work. I'm going to switch back over here. So now I'm going to show you what are the features we can build as a developer to eliminate that experience for your users. So one of the new APIs we've released in Tableau 10 is called the metadata API. And what that allows you to do is, as a developer, you can kind of describe the data model programmatically. This is super nice because often you as a developer know the data better than your end users, and you will eliminate the need for them to go through and build this nice data model themselves. You do it once, all of your users can take advantage of that. So in here, we have a number of different options. You can set the default column types, default column roles. You can add descriptions, aliases. There's a lot of things here. It's all in our documentation. I'm going to show an example of a few of these, though. Lots of monitor switching. OK, so let's dive into some code. Our connector, there's a lot going on here. I'm not going to go into the details. But you'll recognize the get schema and the get data call that you've seen in some of the other connectors you may have built or looked at. All we're doing here is we're pulling our schema from this schema.json file. This is a technique we like to use. It allows you to just have your schema defined in one file, so you don't have to do it in the same JavaScript file that you're building everything else in. You'll see here I have a schema for every single table that you saw in the demo. There's artists, albums. I'm going to come down here to tracks and add some metadata information. I have this prepared so I don't have to write JSON live in front of you. The first thing I'm going to add is a description to the table object. So you'll notice when I was pulling out that tracks table, I wasn't exactly sure what was in that. And so one thing you can do is add a description through the API. that will add a tooltip to that table in Tableau. So this will help your users understand exactly what information they're getting back. Okay, the next thing I'm going to add is an alias to that isExplicit field. So what this is going to do is completely rename that field. The user will never have to do that. You can give it a nice, user-friendly name, and you can use your ID that you've already created programmatically. So that helps you keep track of your fields inside your code. Okay, and then the very last thing we're going to add is the default formatting to that danceability field. We probably want to do this to every single field in our Spotify connector, but I'm just going to do it to one for an example. Formatting this as a percentage, and we're formatting the default aggregation, so it's ready to go. Danceability. There we go. Okay, going to show us working in Tableau real quick. Tableau saved my login information, so I don't do that twice, which is a nice new feature we added recently as well. And now when I connect to data, we're going to see some of that new information we just added. So if I come over here and hover over tracks, we'll see a nice tooltip that describes the table. And then upon dragging it out, we'll see some of the updated information. So if I come over here, I can see the isExplicit field has been renamed. And when we actually come into our viz, we can see some of the updated information. Sam, can you make this a little bit faster?
I blame the hotel Wi-Fi. And you having too much music, I guess.
I just want everything instantaneously. So if we come down here, we'll see our danceability track. I'll pull out name again. Automatically formatted correctly, default aggregation is set correctly, and we see that as a percentage. So that's going to be super helpful, deliver a ton of values to your users to give them a really nice, clean data model to work with. All right. Back to the slide decks. Talking about data models, this is some nice, bonus polish you can add. One thing that's super critical, though, is your users are going to be dealing with a lot of different tables that come back from your connector. And one of the most difficult problems for them is, how do I ensure I'm creating the right data set? So in that Spotify connector, I have 5 tables. You'll notice I went and created a join between artist and track. I had to then go and choose the correct join keys, go through that work. What happens when you have a join that needs to be created that's 10 tables wide? It has complicated schemas. As a developer, you can now provide that information to your users through predefined joins. So this is a new feature we just added in Tableau 10.1 called standard connections. And what this allows you to do is in your schema file, you can actually create these predefined joins. So this is going to save your users a ton of time, and it's going to ensure that they get the right data model in Tableau. Saves them from a lot of basic data modeling mistakes.
Should come up there and switch for you.
I know, I just need a button. Maybe like a foot pedal, that'd be kind of cool. Yeah. All right. The nice thing about this is it's pretty simple from an API standpoint. All right, so I'm gonna come back in here. What I've done is, as you've probably seen before, you pass back table objects to Tableau to define your tables. To create a standard connection, you're just gonna pass back an array of standard connection objects. I've actually already defined these at the bottom of my same schema.json file. So what you need to create a standard connection is you can give it an alias. Then you give it an array of tables that are included in that standard connections. And then finally, the last thing that's important is you give it an array of joins that kind of describes exactly the syntax of that join you want to create. So you'll notice here we have the artist table. ID is the column ID that we want to join that artist table on, and tracks is the table we're joining it to. And so we've defined here, our join keys. We've defined the type of join that it is. We support inner and left join. And you can do as many standard connections as you so choose. I have 2 defined here. So that's how you define standard connections as a JSON object. And how you send that back to Tableau. I'm going to come back over here. You're likely familiar with the get schema call. That's where you pass information about your schema back to Tableau. Previously, without this feature, in order to pass information back to Tableau, you'd say use the schema callback function, and you'd pass in an array of tables. The nice thing here is in order to have standard connections, all you have to do is add one more parameter to this call and pass back that JSON blob of standard connections. So really simple to use. at least from an API standpoint, defining those standard connections can be a little more tricky. All right, we're going to see this in action now. So instead of just having tables now in the data prep canvas, we're going to have standard connection objects as well. You'll notice those up here on the left. So when I drag these out to the data prep canvas, my join is already created. The join keys are already set up. Super easy. Your users do not have to do any work to actually get the right data model that they're interested in. One last new feature that I want to talk about before Sam comes on and talks about debugging is the progress reporting API. You saw this in action earlier. It's a super simple API to use. You just say tableau.reportProgress with a string. If the string's too long, we're going to truncate it, so try and keep the strings a little bit shorter. New API in 10.1, and it can only be used during the get data call of the gather data phase. That's the one restriction. But this can be super helpful. Often if you're connected to really large data sets, your users might get confused if they just see no progress being indicated to them. We've had web data connectors that take an hour to run just because it's so much data, and we've had user feedback that says, hey, I'm not sure if this is still working. I don't really know if it's still actually functioning. So this is kind of an attempt to solve that problem. You can give some indication of status. Okay, with that, Sam is going to talk about some advanced debugging techniques for the web data connector, because it doesn't always go that smoothly if you're building something from scratch.
Yeah.
Sam?
Thanks, Brendan. So I am a developer, as I mentioned before, and while I love Brendan's shiny demos, I think we all know that the code's never right the first time. And it's a challenge to figure out what's going wrong a lot of times. And one issue we have with the web data connector is it's a really kind of a complex runtime. We're running inside of a desktop application. There's an interactive phase where the user can see the web page, but then we actually gather the data in another process. And so there's quite a bit of moving parts here, and it can make it really difficult to figure out what's going on. And this is a pain that we felt a lot internally. And so I'm going to try to share a couple tips and tricks that we use internally when building web data connectors to help you guys along when you get stuck. So the very first thing that I'd be remiss if I did not mention is use the simulator first. We've invested a lot of time into our web data connector simulator. It's part of the SDK. It's on our GitHub page. This is where you want to start. This lets you use all of your normal web browser tools, lets you use all of the debugging tools you're used to, as well as kind of really inspect every aspect of your connector and make sure it's working. So always make sure it works in the simulator before you try it out in Tableau, and you should be able to solve 90% of the issues you're having. But I think we all know that doesn't always work out that way. Has anyone had this happen to them where it seemed to work in the simulator but not in Tableau? No? No one? I got one. All right. It's a common problem. We hear it quite a bit. It's a complaint we hear more often than we'd like, and so I'm going to try to explain a few tricks of what you can do. The core reason for this is the browser that we are running inside of Tableau is a bit outdated. It's an older WebKit browser. We're working on updating this to make the debugging easier, but for now, this is kind of where we are. So I'm going to jump in, and the first technique I'm going to talk about is tailing logs. So Tableau actually does a pretty good job of outputting log statements. In your connector, you can simply do a console.log in JavaScript, and that'll actually get passed down to Tableau's logging system. And the tool I'm going to recommend for viewing your logs is actually a tool we just made open source maybe 2-3 weeks ago called our Tableau Log Viewer. And what the log viewer does is it actually watches Tableau's log directory and will, in real time, pull in each log line, parse it out, and put it in a nice data view like this, which allows you to filter, highlight, search, do all sorts of operations. So this is actually useful for debugging a lot of Tableau things, and it works pretty well for the web data connector as well. So this will work with all versions of the web data connector going back to Tableau 9.1. It works on Windows and Mac. So it's a really useful tool. So you're having issues, add a bunch of logging in, and you can actually see what's going on while you're running your code right away. So I'm going to switch over. Hopefully I can do it better than Brendan. First time. All right, so I'm going to switch over to a version of the Spotify Web Data Connector that I think might have a bug or two in it. I need to start a new quit your Tableau. start this up. And the other tool I'm going to show is, our Tableau log viewer here. So this already has some logging set up in it. Probably make it a little bit bigger. And I will clear this out. Oops. Sorry about that. I'll clear all the events out. And so I've already set this log viewer up with a few tools. So I have it in the highlight mode, where it is using a Web Data Connector only filter. So it'll only show the messages your connector writes to the log. And then this filter actually comes with the log viewer itself. It's on GitHub. And then I have it in the highlight only mode, so we only show matching log statements that'll be highlighted. And so I will connect to my Web Data Connector, which might have a bug or two in it. I might even give it a title like that. So we'll sign in here. Now you guys can judge my music taste. Get data, and I'll pop over to the log viewer, and you can see in my JavaScript, I was running all this code, and so we saw me initialize in the interactive phase. We assigned some authentication tokens. We redirected the login page. We called Tableau submit, set the password, all these things. You kind of see my connector was logging these out. And the other interesting thing to note in here is actually if you look at the file where these logs are coming from. So the log.txt file, that's from the interactive phase when I actually can see the UI in Tableau. And this other phase is the tab protoserve log. This is actually an invisible process we have that Tableau uses to isolate data connections. So we've had this for a long time when we used to have SQL Server drivers crash all the time. So we tried to isolate that out of Tableau's process. And so we do the same with the Web Data Connector. And so you can actually see where this log message is coming from. And in the second phase, I actually initialized in the gather data phase. So I'm going to pull out a quick table here, try to create my viz, and we'll see what happens. Oh, shoot, didn't work. So what I would do at this point is look back in my logs, and I can see I have some nice error messages that got logged out here. I see I have something about bearer authentication required. I think I may have screwed up authentication somehow. So now I can actually look back through my log messages and see that I found an access token, and I am setting the access token to object, which is probably not right. So there's probably a bug through my JavaScript code. I can see the line where this is and actually go back and find exactly where the issue is from here. So I'm not going to go in the code right now. I'm going to show one more tool that I could use to find this exact same bug. So the other tool I wanted to introduce is our interactive debugger. I need to send out as many disclaimers as possible. This is in beta. I added it during a hackathon a few months ago. I don't think anyone in our legal team knows it's there. It's accessible by passing a command line argument to Tableau when you start it. And what it actually does is it puts a user interface on top of that invisible process I was telling you guys about earlier when you're in the gather data phase. And what the interface is actually a standard WebKit debugger console. So you have a lot of the useful tools you're used to there. And you can really inspect and see exactly how your connector is working. A couple of caveats. This tool is Windows only, and it only works in Tableau 10 and higher. So I am going to jump over and show a demo of that as well. We promised there'd be lots of demos. So for this, I'll need to switch over to my Parallels machine running Windows here. And so I have an instance of Tableau already running. You can see I've ran it with the -d debug WDC flag enabled, which is telling Tableau to use this debugger. I'll go over to my workbook, select Web Data Connector, go to my connector with an error. It's the same connector we saw last time. And so you notice when I'm in this phase, there's no UI, there's no debugger. We just kind of have the standard Tableau view. When I click Get Data here is when we're going to switch from the interactive to the gather data phase. And when that switch happens is when we'll spin up that new process and we'll show that new UI. So right here, it should pop up in a second. There it is. So this is actually the UI on top of this page. The debugger tends to take a little longer than I would like to load. I don't really know why. And the other kind of really key thing here, we have some really good docs on our GitHub page talking through this, is you'll need to enable debugging when you first launch this. So it's the first time setup, but you'll need to set that option. And so what I can actually see is I have a debugger statement and a little comment that's actually coming from Tableau's code saying you can configure your breakpoints. So I can go in and look at actually all the code in my web data connector, set breakpoints, configure things. So I have a couple different breakpoints set already in here, and get things going the way I want it. So if I hit continue, we're actually going to see I had my init function called here. And so if you've ever been curious exactly what goes on inside Tableau's code, you can see this pretty clearly. So here's the Tableau object that we're using, and the API version and all these various settings we give you available. I can see what password I have set. You can really kind of dig deep into what's going on with your code. And so I can obviously see here that my password is a little strange, and I'll step a couple lines here and see when I get my access token, here's my bug. Instead of returning the access token, I commented it out for some reason and returned the wrong thing. So this is a really useful tool to kind of jump in and see exactly what's going on with your code while it's running in Tableau. If you're having some issues with differences in browsers and things like that, you can run things from the console. You can really do anything you can imagine and get a really good sense of how things work inside of Tableau. One other tool I was just going to show quick when I actually make a request with this tool is I'll pull out a sheet or a table, try to create my extract, and we actually see we'll hit this breakpoint now. This is where I tried to send a request and failed. I can see that same error that I saw in the logs and actually go over to the networks tab even and see the exact network request I made. So this really lets you dive deep and do it from within Tableau. So I think that is it for the interactive debugger. I'm going to pop over to the slides again here. And so I just showed you guys two techniques that we really like. What happens if you're still stuck? We do have a couple of places for you to go. Brendan and I are both, Brendan more than me, but he tells me when I should answer things, are active on the GitHub community, the Tableau forums, as well as we have a Tableau tag on Stack Overflow. So we monitor all these. We love hearing what people are building, finding out what they're stuck on. So we're more than happy to help. So tell us if you're stuck. Tell us if you need help. We're here to help you guys be successful with this platform. So that's all I have for debugging. Does anyone have any questions about that before we move on? The next topic will be authentication. You good? All right. So let's talk about authentication. Oh, we have an error. OK, let's talk about authentication. So in my experience, the majority of interesting data sources we see have some sort of authentication in front of them. There's a lot of cool demo connectors we have to open data. But the stuff that you're going to build for your companies or you're going to really be interested is your own personal data that's protected. And so you need to have some form of authentication. And this is actually a strength of the Web Data Connector is its flexibility. You have a web page, you can do basic authentication, you can do an OAuth flow, you could do all sorts of various authentication flows. So that is great. Your initial flow is real easy, you can get things done. Where things get a little bit trickier is when you open up that workbook 2 weeks later and you want to refresh your data. You don't have this kind of initial flow of starting from scratch. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the nuances we have and how that works within Tableau. The main kind of way I like to wrap my head around this topic is, so Tableau has a couple different ways you would open up an existing workbook. Let's say you're connected to an Excel file. There's no password. We just need the file path. That's fine. It just opens up, nothing needed. Another example would be connecting to something like MySQL. When you open that workbook up and try to reconnect, you have to enter a server name, a username, and a password. So that's just kind of a basic form. And the last example would be something like Google Analytics, where you have to re-authenticate against Google using their OAuth flow and things like that. And so that's kind of a third model of authentication. And so what we're trying to do is essentially fit Web Data Connector into one of those three models. And the way you do this is you assign a Tableau object has a property called auth type. And so you assign the type of authentication you have, and that tells Tableau kind of how to react when the user needs to re-authenticate. And so the type of authentication, yeah, it changed how those flows work. We have some really good docs in this as well that I highly encourage you to look at if you get stuck. And I'm kind of going to go into each one of the 3 types now. So the first type is none. This is kind of like the Excel file. It's really easy. This is the default. Nothing really to worry about. An example would be an open API from the government. This is, I think, what a lot of people start with web data connectors, and it can be very, very powerful. And so you would assign tableau.authType to this enumeration of none. The next type is basic authentication. Now, this is essentially saying all I need is the tableau.username and tableau.password. I don't need any custom user interface. I don't need my user to have to be prompted any more than this dialog that actually pops up when they reopen their workbook. So this could be an internal corporate network where you have Active Directory going, or it could be a website that just uses actual HTTP basic authentication. So this is kind of another set. There's a smaller set of connectors that use this, but it's really useful if your connector can be done this way, because it makes writing the connector easiest. So I have a sample that's up on our GitHub. I was going to demo it. I think we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to skip through it now. This connector uses basic authentication and actually is a .NET app running on the server side, which uses the username and password provided from Tableau to authenticate a user against Active Directory and make sure that they have access to whatever resource they have. So this is up on my GitHub. I'll put those up at the end. I'm going to skip through that for now just to try to save some time here. And so our third and final type of authentication is what we call our custom auth. So what custom auth is, you'd set tableau.authType equals custom. And what this means is when the user reopens the workbook and tries to re-authenticate, we're actually going to pop up your web data connector again in an authentication phase. So this basically tells you that all I need is you to reset the Tableau username and password so we can get into actually refreshing the data and reconnecting to your data source. So for example, our Spotify connector is using OAuth, and so we have it set to use the custom auth type. So the next thing I'm going to cover, I'm going to show a demo of that in a couple of minutes. The next thing I want to cover is actually OAuth, because this is something we hear constantly about, and people trying to get OAuth right. It's a tricky thing to do. It's a really powerful tool, but it can be challenging to get right. So a quick high-level view of OAuth. It's a way of delegating authentication without having to provide an API or without having to provide a connector your actual username and password. So for our Spotify connector, I registered as a Spotify developer, or I think Brendan did actually, and set up some parameters. And basically what Spotify does then is it lets me do this kind of redirect flow where the user can sign in against Spotify, and then Spotify gives me an access token that gives me limited access to the user's account. I never know their username, never know their password, and so the user can trust me in a very limited sense. So I'm going to kind of go through the way an OAuth flow works inside of Tableau, and then we'll kind of walk through this in code as well. So the first step is we would load up a web data connector. So we have a Spotify web data connector. This connector is going to, in step one, it's going to check if it has authentication. If it does not, we'll redirect to the Spotify login page, like we saw in those samples before. The user will then sign in to the Spotify login page, and there'll be a code that will be sent back to our server that's running. In our case, it's a small Node.js server. And so this temporary code is what Spotify gives us. Our server then actually talks directly to Spotify and exchanges this temporary code for an official access token. So this access token is what gives us access to the Spotify API. So in the bug I was showing before, I wasn't setting the access token properly, so Spotify said you're not allowed to access this resource. So then the final step after we get the access token back is we send the access token down to our web data connector, and then the web data connector will store it in the Tableau.password field. So that's actually the flow of how kind of OAuth works in Tableau. I'm going to attempt to show this. It's a bit of a tricky demo, so bear with me if something goes awry. But let me switch over, and we'll kind of go through each of those 6 steps. So remember those steps. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to use our Web Data Connector simulator, actually. And I'm going to use an in-private tab. Otherwise, we might not be able to demo it very well. Let me just set the password here. OK. So this is kind of step 1, is I have my connector here. And I'm going to start the interactive phase. So this is when the user would see this. So we load it up. And actually, as you saw, we had a breakpoint hit right away. I think that was not supposed to happen, but that's OK. So this was actually step 1 and 2 happening right away. So here's my server code, and we're redirecting to Spotify's login page. So my code detected that I didn't have a password, and it wants to redirect me to accounts.spotify.com. So I'm going to continue here. If I switch back over, we see now we're at the point where I need to log in with Spotify. So I will log in, and after I log in here, we're going to go to step 3, which would be the Spotify connector will redirect back to my server with that temporary code. So when I hit login here, we'll see my server code pop up again. So here we go. The callback got called from Spotify. I can actually see inside this that here's that temporary code Spotify gave me. And see we have step 2 or step 3 marked here. So the next step I'll need to do is step 4, which is actually when I exchange that temporary code for an actual access token. So I'm making a request to Spotify using this code here. And when I get a response back from Spotify, I should have an actual access token. So here we go. We got that back. Looks like the status code is 200, and here's my access token. So now my server has an access token. I need to send it back to the connector, and that's step 5. So there's a number of ways to send this back to the connector. The way we're doing it here is by adding a query string, or a query hash. And that will actually, the connector's JavaScript will read that. So I'll hit continue here, and it looks like we're redirected. Let me go back to the page. So here's my Spotify, and I'm going to look at the code for this page. And we can actually see in the sources here that we have, I'm just going to refresh the page here quick. And so here's step 6, is where I actually can get the access token from my Spotify, from the URL. So we see Tableau.password is going to be set to this access token I just got. Hit continue. Close the tools here, get data. And we can actually see in the simulator we have my password set. So that is a really, really high-level overview of kind of how OAuth works. The next thing I want to try to demo real quick here is how the authentication phase works. So this was, when I was talking a little earlier about the auth phases, there was the custom auth phase. So the scenario I'm going to show here would be I have a Tableau workbook that I created a little while ago. Let me start a new session here so we don't have any passwords saved. This workbook is actually going against my Spotify tracks, so you guys can really, really judge my music now. So let's open this up quick. It'll actually open without authenticating me because it's based off of an extract. And you can see here's number of tracks I have by artist. I'm going to click into the Mr. Wives. They're actually playing at the show tonight. I have a couple songs by them. So we'll click into here. I will add a couple of their tracks. And so we can see if they go from 3rd up to 1st in a sec here. So at this point, I want to refresh my data. And I haven't signed in on this instance yet. So I'm not sure how Tableau is going to do this because it didn't save my password. So what I'll actually do is I'll just right-click here, extract and refresh. And when I try to refresh this, my web data connector is going to come back up, and it'll be in the authentication phase. So I click refresh, and sure enough, here's my connector. We're actually hitting those same breakpoints because this is running on my local server here. And you see it's asking me to sign back in. The main way you can tell this is in the authentication phase versus the other parts of the web data connector is we don't have any navigation bar at the top. We want the user to sign in. They know what their data source is. They know what they're connected to. So just let them do that. So I will sign in here really quick. And what else you'll notice is when I sign in, instead of having me select what my date range is, my connector is just going to submit immediately because all it was asked for was for me to sign back in. So I'll log in. We'll actually hit these breakpoints we just saw a few minutes ago. And once all that gets back, I can switch to Tableau. You can see it updating. So look at this third entry here. Once our query finishes. Always dangerous doing a live data. Loading up, showing the progress. Come on. There it goes. So now you can see my data is updated with what I just changed in Spotify. So you could see a user doing this for all sorts of scenarios. If you had a Fitbit connector you wanted to refresh nightly or something like that, you could do all sorts of good scenarios and let them get right back into their flow with fresh data using the authentication concepts we have here. So that is all I have for authentication. I'm going to hand it back over to Brendan, who's going to talk about how this all works on Tableau server.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. So our last and shortest topic is going to talk about how you share your work with Tableau server. Great, you made an awesome web data connector that connects to Spotify. It's super cool. Then you made a sweet visualization that you want to share with the rest of your company. So you publish it to server, and then you can have that scheduled refresh on server, and it just works. It turns out it doesn't quite work like that. So I want to just mention the caveats of dealing with Tableau server before we close this session. So the core problem is if you're a server admin, you don't want your users to be able to publish arbitrary JavaScript that runs on your server. There's some security issues there. You get a lot of protection because it's running in a sandbox environment, and so it can't do anything too wonky. But there's a potential that rogue WDC could access some local resources that you don't want them to. So in order to get around this, what we have is a server whitelisting mechanism. And what this allows your server admin to do is just say, hey, I trust these connectors to do certain things. And so I'm going to walk through just exactly what this looks like. Let's say you have your Spotify WDC. It's running on a server. The URL of that WDC is what the user's connected to in their Tableau desktop instance. And then you have that published to Tableau server. So in order to get this WDC to refresh on server, the server admin needs to go in. Sorry, forgot that animation was there. The server admin needs to go in and enter information into a whitelist. And so this is done through the tabadmin command. Basically, it just needs to say, hey, I trust the connectors that are running on my server.wdc. You can enter a specific WDC URL there, or you can use regex to say just anything on this domain I trust. So that's the whitelist. That's the first thing the server admin needs to do. But this isn't the full picture, because what would happen if you say, I trusted this WDC on this domain, and then the author of that WDC went and changed their code to do something malicious? So in order to protect against that instance, we have a secondary whitelist. And the purpose of the secondary whitelist is to say, these are the domains that this specific connector is allowed to talk to. So for every instance in the primary whitelist, for every connector listed there, there's a secondary whitelist that says this connector is allowed to talk to these domains. And so this is a very robust security mechanism. Once it's set up by your server admin, your connectors will be able to function completely. And that's just a way to make sure that your information stays safe and there's nothing malicious happening from the connector end. Few caveats. The whitelisting mechanism, as I just described, is a 10.0 feature and beyond. WDC was released in 9.1, so in Tableau 9 versions, there was a different mechanism called importing. Similar concept, but a lot less flexible. It required the tab server admin to actually import the code onto their server. So in order to run a WDC on server, the code had to actually live on server. Not very flexible. If you ever wanted to make an edit to your connector, you'd have to re-import all the code. But just be aware that is what you'd have to deal with if you're running 9.1, 9.2, or 9.3 server. Second caveat, WDC for Tableau Online. We are the administrators of Tableau Online, so you cannot whitelist connectors to run on Tableau Online, unfortunately. So if you're dealing with a WDC for Tableau Online, we ask that you use the sync client. It's a great tool for that. And finally, we do have a resource here. If you are a server admin and want to vet a connector, just kind of get a sense of if it's doing anything malicious, we have some guidance there to help you do that. Wrong direction. OK. That is the end of our talk. We've talked about dealing with complex schemas, how to make an experience a lot better for your end user to get them really nice, rich data models. We've talked about debugging, what happens when your connector is not working in Tableau. We've talked a lot about authentication, and finally we've talked a little bit about Tableau Server and how to deal with WDCs on Tableau Server. I have a resource slide I wanted to end with. Again, we have these utility tools. This will get you all of the source code used in the developer track as well as all the slides. Encourage you to check them out. There's a Tableau developer portal. This is kind of our landing page for developer content. It'll link out to every single API that we have. There's the forum there to ask questions about the different APIs. For WDC specifically, our docs site is tabsoft.co/WDC. Got a lot of nice tutorials. Everything we covered here today has rich documentation built around it, so it's a great place to start. There's also our GitHub link there. And finally, sample code from today. If you want the Spotify connector with OAuth built in, go check it out on my GitHub. Sam also has the basic authentication sample on his GitHub that goes against Active Directory and does basic authentication. So super useful starting places. Check them out. We just built them a few weeks ago, so there's probably rough around the edges, and we'd love feedback. And you can also contribute to them because they're open source. Session repeat tomorrow, if anyone's interested in attending again, or if you want to recommend it to a friend, that's where that'll be. Some related sessions I want to call out. Tomorrow there's a writing your first web data connector session. There's also one today. I didn't get that added here, but if you want to go back a step and just walk through the specifics of building a web data connector, or if that's interesting to someone you know. And then another one I wanted to call out is the Dev Storytime session. That's from a Tableau developer talking about their experience building a production web data connector. It would be super interesting. Finally, we definitely want your feedback. Tableau is feedback obsessed as our culture. We have like pre-built visualizations that gathers all the feedback that you will give us, and then we can use that to adjust our talks that are coming up tomorrow and then in the future. So please leave feedback, super valuable. We want to make this as relevant and awesome as possible for you. Again, Sam and Brendan, it's been awesome having you here, and we want to open it up for questions if you have any. Also, please stick around, come chat with us. We don't have anything going on for a few hours, so we'd love to talk. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was about connecting to sort of Adobe Analytics and some of the bigger web vendors. That is something do not take this as a quote on when any of these are coming. We do have an internal team who has worked on adding connectivity for QuickBooks Online and Marketo are a couple of our connectors that we've built on this platform. And all of those types of large web apps and things like that are definitely targets for us. So I don't have any idea where those two are in our stack, but it's definitely something we're thinking about building, and we have a team dedicated to churning these connectors out.
Yeah. This is a platform we're definitely invested in. We're using it internally all the time.
What web server were you guys running when you guys were going back to VS Code and designing some of it?
It was just a simple Node.js and Express web server. Yeah, actually, the SDK it comes with that web server built in. Yeah.
There's also a sample in the SDK for connecting to Foursquare, and that has OAuth examples, but it also has a simple backend node server that does some of the OAuth requests.
Are all these slides part of the business model?
They are.
I'm taking pictures of saying them.
Oh, we felt honored that they were worth taking pictures of. It was kind of nice feedback.
I'll keep doing it then.
Anyone else?
I believe right now we have it locked down to just HTTP and HTTPS. I know we have the file protocol explicitly disabled, and I'm pretty sure it's a whitelist of just those two. If that's something that would enable you, I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't. It would probably be a matter of me writing a line of code, so it's definitely doable.
You like doing that, though, right?
I do,
okay,
yeah.
Good.
Well, so send us an email
or
with your use case, or come chat with us, and yeah, we'll let you know. Yeah, so the question was about connecting to live data instead of extracts. Unfortunately, not right now. The way the platform's kind of architected is we've kind of thought of going that way. And the issues we've had with it is to connect to live data, your connector needs to know how to process filters and do aggregation and do a kind of a lot of extra work that we think is like maybe a little too much heavy lifting for a connector. That being said, we would love to have a way to keep them a little fresher without going through the menus and having the user have to know they have to do a couple clicks to refresh. Definitely something we'd love to do. And if you have a specific use case, that always helps us prioritize our list if there's something we're really missing. So let us know. So the question is, is it possible to wrap an OData connector into a Web Data Connector? Yeah, it is actually. I looked into it once. There's a good Apache library. It's all in JavaScript for. Yep. Yeah. Exactly. So if you, sorry. You mean like a OData connector in Tableau's sense when you start from the. Okay. Yeah. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that. If it has a REST endpoint or anything like that, you can process it. Yeah, you could pull that back in. Yeah, that'd be super useful actually. Yeah.
So one in the back. Okay. Not really. You want?
Yeah. So the question was about basically embedding multiple credentials on server, right? So you want to have one published data source out there, have a user log in when they view the viz and see their own data. So that you could do now.
That you could do now. It's a little tricky because you'd have to build in the full refresh token on your end in the connector. And then there's also some limitations, like if the refresh token becomes invalid, you have to republish. There's nothing you can really do in that situation. So yeah, that's possible. We can talk more about that if you want.
Yeah. So if you have a source that will give you an indefinite length access token or refresh token, it's much more doable. It gets a little bit trickier when you have credentials that expire, essentially, which a lot of these OAuth providers actually do. It's something that we have kind of enabled for some of our internal connectors, and we would love to make it available externally, and hopefully will be coming kind of down the line as well.
Yeah, we don't yet have a way either to say, to prompt a user for a credential on server and just get their own data. That's something we're definitely exploring, though. We really want to do that at some point. Yeah. Cool. Well, awesome. We'll be up here. Thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Hi.
I'm from Apple, and